just over 100 years ago, a wandering prospector, a German by origin called Karl Mauch, searching for gold, came through these remote hills on a long trail and stumbled on this. He was the first white man ever to see it. And what he'd found, though he didn't know, were the largest man-made structures in any part of old Africa south of the valley of the Nile. What were these mysterious ruins found so unexpectedly in the far interior of Africa? About the ancient history of the black peoples, nothing was remembered in the outside world or even known. Today, at last, we're beginning to learn. We know now that these great buildings stood at the heart of a powerful black kingdom. Within these almost overwhelming walls, the kings lived in royal seclusion, adding to their mystery according to the nature of kings. Invested with a religious as well as a temporal power, they were believed to embody the whole welfare of their people. A stone-built city in the heart of Africa, and yet the white people who first saw it were so blinded by their prejudices that they could not believe the evidence of their own eyes. Rather than face the possibility that Africans might have a history of their own, they fabricated exotic explanations and imagined fantastic rites in honor of faraway monarchs like King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. The famous German philosopher Friedrich Hegel had set the tone. Though he'd never been to Africa and knew nothing of its people, this was his publicly expressed opinion in 1831.
This is the land where men are children, a land lying beyond the daylight of self-conscious history and enveloped in the black color of night. At this point, let us forget Africa, not to mention it again. For Africa is no historical part of the world.
Hegel was not alone. His views were echoed widely. An English explorer who did know Africa and had studied some of its customs and languages, Richard Burton, had this to say.
The study of the Negro is the study of man's rudimental mind. He would appear rather a degeneracy from the civilized man than a savage rising to the first step, were it not for his total incapacity for improvement. He has not the ring of the true metal. There is no rich nature for education to cultivate. He seems to belong to one of those childish races, never rising to man's estate, who fall like worn-out links from the great chain of animated nature.
Another famous explorer, Samuel Baker, who passed through this very district in his search for the source of the Nile, wrote in his memoirs,
"Human nature, viewed in its crudest state as seen amongst African savages, is quite on the level with that of the brute, and not to be compared with the noble character of the dog. There is neither gratitude, pity, love, or self-denial, no idea of duty, no religion, nothing but covetousness, ingratitude, selfishness, and cruelty."
In a manner which seems quite unforgivable today, Europeans in the 18th and 19th centuries preferred to forget what their forebears had known very well, that kingdoms flourished in West Africa which were as sumptuous and as well governed as any in medieval Europe itself. What is more, the reports of traders and diplomats who visited these kingdoms assumed no attitudes of racial superiority. Racism, in fact, is a rather modern sickness. Nothing more clearly illustrates the change that was to come than the European art of the Renaissance, and earlier still. White and black take their place in these paintings with equal dignity. There's no hint here of what a later world was to call human nature in its crudest state. And this acceptance of equality between black and white had also been a keynote of the Middle Ages. Among the revered saints of Central Europe was the black martyr, St. Maurice. As we shall see, he's one of the heroes of this story. What then was the cause of this enormous change in white attitudes from equality to racist prejudice? History gives one dominating reply: the Atlantic trade in slaves. Based in strong castles on the West African coast, the nations of Europe vied with each other in the massive removal of millions of captured men and women. Their guns were not pointed at Africa, which was seldom regarded as a source of danger, but out to sea, ready to face rival ships suddenly appearing over the horizon. Africans, of course, have not been the only victims of racism and color prejudice. But if, as I believe, they've suffered more acutely than the other peoples of the world, the reason lies here. For over 300 years, this magnificent coast was the scene of organized and systematic cruelty. Year after year, black people were dragged from their homes into the white man's world of misery and degradation. They were presented as less than human, objects for buying and selling, like cattle, against whom any act of violence and debasement was justified. Wherever the slave trade spread its ruin, the stability and fabric of African life were destroyed. But something else was also destroyed, and that was the mutual respect which had previously existed between white and black. But after all, the slave trade ended a long time ago. Surely it's time to think again. Those old ideas about black inferiority were completely wrong, without foundation. As it happens, modern science has given us a vast fund of new and reliable knowledge which shows that the black peoples do indeed have a history of their own, as rich and strange, as long and sometimes surprising as any major branch of the human family. On the high plateau of Central Africa, in what is now modern Zimbabwe, stand the Matopo Hills. Large numbers of leopards inhabit these rock formations, which in their strange mystery and shape seem to take us back to the carvings of ancient African history. To the people of this region, this unearthly landscape has always been a sacred place, and still is to this day. Tucked away in these Matopo hills, there are messages from the very dawn of history. This is the Nswatugi Cave, one of the many rock shelters in the Matopos that were decorated by the people who lived here in ancient times. These truly marvelous rock paintings were inspired by motives that we don't know. Probably there was a variety of motives, as with all great art. Those distant peoples who faced the wild wilderness of primeval Africa must surely have felt the need for psychological and spiritual reassurance, as well as for magic to safeguard their cattle. And their artists of long ago clearly loved to portray the animals they knew. The land was ideally suited by its climate for man and beast to prosper. And even today, perhaps 3,000 or 4,000 years later, it's easy to recognize duiker, kudu, antelope, and giraffe. The arid wilderness of the Great Sahara, 3,000 miles to the north, could hardly be in greater contrast. Yet here, in the 1950s, even more surprising evidence was found of early African history. Today, the place belongs to the creatures of the desert, lizards, scorpions, and snakes that can survive the searing temperatures of this thirsty land, one of the driest and most desolate regions on Earth. Water is the rarest and most precious commodity. Yet, even here, it must once have flowed in abundance. The revelation of these rock paintings in the Tassili Mountains of the Algerian Sahara just 30 years ago astonished the world. Whole communities of people who were obviously African in origin had created marvelous galleries of ancient art depicting most vividly the life of the Green Sahara, as it must once have been. First we see hunting folk and the animals they lived among, the clearest proof that this region of the Sahara long ago teemed with wild game. The earliest paintings may be 7,000 or 8,000 years old. But not all the people who inhabited this huge region were nomadic hunters. This horse, complete with saddle and bridle, points to the development of transport systems and traders. And this ox-drawn plough to the planting and growing of crops. Whether for war or sport, elaborate chariots came into use, while the clothing of these people bears a striking resemblance to the tunics of ancient Egypt. The evidence of these paintings suggests a continuous community of peoples living right across the Sahara, from the Atlantic to the valley of the Nile. Then, some 4,500 years ago, the climate began to undergo a disastrous change. Gradually, the Sahara lost its rainfall, its animal life, and finally, its people. Abandoning their increasingly arid pastures, more and more people from the Sahara had to join their forerunners and follow the trails in search of a secure supply of water. Some headed for the tropical rainforests which lay to the south and west. Others moved east towards the valley of the River Nile. Fed by Africa's greatest lake, the Nile runs north for over 4,000 miles before reaching its outflow in the Mediterranean Sea. It's the longest river on Earth, and no river anywhere pushes on so relentlessly through mile after mile of vast and rainless desert regions after it's been joined by the Blue Nile tumbling down from the mountain plateau of Ethiopia. But the Nile is more than a great river. It's a whole library of the history we're looking for. From the earliest times of human settlement along the river, some 10,000 years ago, the Nile was the giver of life to ancient communities who came to its banks and farmed on fertile soil that was enriched unfailingly, year by year, by the flood of silt. Those early people were among the ancestors of the Egyptians and the Sudanese of today. Others may have come from the Middle East, but the archaeological evidence combines to show that the main lines of incoming migration were from the southwest and the west. In other words, from the African communities of the Sahara. 5,000 years ago, this homeland had already become the scene of a civilization in many ways unmatched anywhere else in the ancient world. This is where we have to begin, in the Egypt of the pharaohs, in the African land that was the gift of the god of the Nile. It's easy enough to believe, within these corridors built to a gigantic scale and yet wonderfully proportioned, that you've entered a world sprung complete from the lap of the gods. Egypt of the pharaohs was the greatest and the oldest and the most inventive of all the high civilizations of antiquity. And it flourished for 3,000 years. It set a pattern, an example for peoples near and far. But where were its roots, its origins, its starting point? Most of us have believed or have been taught that the glories of the pharaohs could never have been created by African people or African ideas because, it's been said, Africans could never have built a high civilization. Here reigned for dynasty after dynasty the kings who wore the double crown, the combined crown of Upper Egypt and of the Delta. But what had they to do with Africa? How could this grand hierarchy of gods and spirits have anything in common with the superstitious mumblings of the black peoples of inner Africa? Wandering among the treasures of the Cairo Museum, it's easy to think of the Egypt of the pharaohs as a civilization complete within itself, owing little or nothing to outside influences from whatever source, entirely its own creation. And I imagine that most visitors conclude as they listen to their guides that a statue such as this of the young king Tutankhamun may have turned very black in the course of centuries, but could not have been a black man in the first place. It's a view which is now increasingly under challenge, not least from African historians and archaeologists. One of the more outspoken of these is Professor Cheikh Anta Diop of Senegal, who has made a special study of the origins of the people of ancient Egypt.
Contemporains des Égyptiens et même des philosophes du 19e siècle. Voici, dans le tombeau de Ramsès III, au XIIe siècle avant Jésus-Christ, les 4 races connues des Égyptiens représentées sur le même plan. Ici, vous avez l'Égyptien, le type générique de la race, en noir charbon, si je puis dire, avec toutes ses particularités ethniques. Et sur le même tableau, vous avez le type indo-européen représenté également, avec toutes ces différences par rapport au type égyptien, du point de vue de la couleur de la peau et du point de vue du vêtement. Et ici, vous avez les autres Africains qui habitaient à l'époque l'intérieur du continent représentés de la même façon que les Égyptiens.
That particular painting, however, is a rare exception, the only one, as far as I know, that so clearly makes the professor's point. For the most part, the ancient Egyptians had themselves portrayed as reddish-pink, but of course they intermarried with Asians, and even more with other Africans. Many of their noble ladies were Nubians and lovingly portrayed as such. This painting comes from the tomb of Hemaka, clearly a black lady, with a handmaiden behind her, just as surely white. It followed that the royal children were often black as well, as was King Senusret, seen here wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt. Or this pharaoh, of unknown name, but obviously of high prestige in his time, and just as clearly African. Elephantine Island in the Nile marked the border between Egypt and Nubia, and was a place of great sanctity in ancient times. Among the travelers who came here were the earliest European historians, the Greeks, men like Herodotus, brought up as he was in the classical tradition which regarded the various races of the known world as different but equal. The Greeks knew Egypt well and firmly believed that the original Egyptians were black people who had come from the south to settle the land of the Nile. But Herodotus himself got no further than this. He was prevented by the first cataract from traveling further south. And so he never saw the huge temple which Ramesses II chose to build here at Abu Simbel, further south into inner Africa than any other great monument built by the pharaohs to celebrate their power. A few years ago, with immense ingenuity, the entire structure was lifted to a new site, above the artificial lake which has drowned all the sites of the most ancient kingdoms that flourished here in Nubia, even before the first of the pharaohs. But why should he have built this great temple so far to the south? Perhaps because his queen, Nefertari, was herself a Nubian. And also because these were the people of the south, whom he wanted to impress with evidence of the prisoners he'd taken in faraway Syria and Asia Minor. Even mighty temples like this one have to be seen against the background origins of ancient Egyptian civilization. And those origins, in the light of modern science, were above all African. No matter what ideas or customs the pharaohs may have found in the Asian lands they conquered, Egypt's beginnings were in the south, in this inner Africa, which the ancient Egyptians called the land of the gods, of the African gods whom they revered as their guardian spirits. The time came when Egyptian conquests ended. 400 years later, it was the turn of the kings of the south of Nubia, who now marched north to subdue the power of Egypt itself. And here is the most famous of those mighty kings of the south, recognized by the peoples of that time, the 7th century BC, as among the masters of the world. This one, as it happens, received a favorable mention in the Bible, in the Book of Kings, as the emperor of Kush and of all Egypt, whose name was Taharka.